There's no doubt that the Chinese government is attempting to let everyone in the region know just who the new big dog on the block is. Let's make no bones about it, it was an exercise in intimidation. The fact that there were not one but two live fire exercises, the fact that there was no formal notification to government, that was a sign that China intends to do what the hell it likes.
2025 is a year of change. Cultural and political disruption is transforming our nation and the global order. The rebellion against the establishment has accelerated. Australia and the Western Alliance is now at a crossroads. Either the mainstream will continue its ascendancy or the elites will prevail. Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our viewers. Great to be with you. Today we'll be talking about Chinese warships, the Western Australian election, and the latest in the US. Tony, great to be back with you.
And good to be with you, Dan.
Yeah, great. So we'll start with China. So we had Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia a couple of weeks ago, and these weren't just a couple of warships. They had intelligence gathering ships, replenishment ships, and of course this comes on the back of a deployment last year into around Vanuatu, where they had a couple of very large warships there as well. So clearly China is flexing its muscles in the region. So there's a lot to be, I think, concerned and aware of. What's your assessment of China's activities when it comes to that particular deployment?
I think there's no doubt that the Chinese government is attempting to let everyone in the region know just who the new big dog on the block is. It was designed to send a very strong message to us and to the region that China is a force to be reckoned with, that American power is no longer unchallenged, that we can't take for granted that the Pacific is a calm lake. So it was, let's make no bones about it, it was an exercise in intimidation. The fact that there were not one but two live fire exercises, the fact that there was no formal notification to government, that was a sign that China intends to do what the hell it likes, regardless of any view that we have. Our government can talk about the normalisation of relations, but this is the new normal. The new normal is that China will attempt to bully us into a form of submission. And probably the most disturbing aspect of this incursion into our home waters was the fact that we appeared almost entirely unaware, and when we did become aware, it seemed that we were relying on New Zealand to do the naval shadowing. I gather that the two replenishment ships that we need to deploy our frigates on major exercises are both in various forms of repair, and it just goes to show the urgent need to build up and strengthen our armed forces, but particularly the Navy, also the Air Force. I mean, this is another topic that we'll get onto, I presume, later in the discussion, but America under Trump is much more transactional than before. It expects, understandably, its allies to do more for themselves, and I suppose in that sense this Chinese visitation, this Chinese Navy circumnavigation of Australia is another sign that we are going to have to do a lot more for ourselves when it comes to our military strength and our preparedness for tensions and, dare I say it, possible conflicts to come. We're only going to preserve the peace through strength. We certainly are not going to preserve it through weakness, because, as my friend Andrew Hastie often says, weakness is provocative, and what we saw from Australia last week was a weakness.
When you were Prime Minister, how would you sort of deal with these sort of situations? Because it's not necessarily abnormal for an adversary to deploy naval fleets in certain contexts, although this seems a bit more than usual. What would your approach have been to sort of managing these matters?
Well, I do recall that at the time of the G20 in 2014, there was a Russian flotilla that came, dare I say it, menacingly close to Brisbane. It was timed for the appearance of Vladimir Putin, who I'd recently shirt-fronted, orally at least, over the MH17 atrocity. So a Russian flotilla came down the Barrier Reef and lurked off Brisbane for a few days. We knew exactly where it was the whole way. It was shadowed by our Orion aircraft, and they have an anti-ship capability. It was also shadowed by, from memory, a couple of Australian warships. So we probably had as much firepower on the spot as the Russians did. I note that the two Russian warships were accompanied by an ocean-going tug, which made me question their reliability. But nevertheless, they were there. It wasn't a friendship visit, obviously. They didn't call into any ports. They were there to let us know that Russia was still a power to be reckoned with. But I think on that particular occasion, we let them know that we were every bit up for the challenge. Now, I don't think the response was nearly as satisfactory this time. It was, I know the Prime Minister's got a difficult job. I know he's got a lot on his plate. But to suggest that it was just some kind of normal rite of passage as opposed to an exercise in naked strength, that was a total misreading of the situation.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, obviously, with the US potentially being less willing to provide support to certain allies, that we're going to have to step up. What does that look like to you? I mean, there's obviously the calls that we've done at the IPA as well, from 2 to 3% of spending of GDP on defence, which is a part of it, but obviously the spending needs to be more targeted and more timely than what is currently the case. What would you like to see, particularly in the naval context, because we know China now has the biggest naval fleet by number, not necessarily by capability, but certainly by number. What would you like to see?
And the point of the Chinese Navy is that it can concentrate in East Asia, whereas the American Navy has global responsibility. So their numerically smaller Navy is much more spread out than the People's Liberation Army Navy. The other point, of course, is that the Chinese Navy is operating well within range of Chinese missiles, whereas the American Navy is operating at great distance from its land bases or its major land bases. So what should we do? Well, there's absolutely no doubt that we're going to have to spend a lot more on our military. But rather than simply spend, we've got to do quite a bit of thinking. And that was the beauty of the recent book by Peter Jennings, Michael Shoebridge and Marcus Hellier, which was launched the other day by Sir Peter Cosgrove. This is a very comprehensive attempt to look at Australia's strategic situation, to consider our historical force structure, and to look at what needs to be done differently and better. And as I said, it's not just a question of spending more, it's a question of working out exactly what our problems are and exactly what sort of a military we need. So we need long-range strike. Eventually, the AUKUS subs will provide that, but we need it now, not in 10 or 15 years' time. And the Jennings book talks about getting the latest iteration of the American strategic bomber, which we could get on a shorter time frame than the AUKUS subs. It talks about increasing the size of the Navy, increasing the size of the Air Force, increasing the size of the Army, defensive as well as offensive missiles. It talks about the importance of being able to ramp up our forces quickly if necessary, not necessarily through national service, but through a much bigger system of reserves. Looking at the Ukraine war, it says that you need to have less small numbers of exquisite platforms than large numbers of easier to produce platforms, because the exquisite platforms need highly specialised operators that take years to train. As Ukraine shows, your highly trained operators might be dead 3 months into a conflict, so you need to be able to train up people quickly. You need to have platforms that can be replaced quickly in large numbers. So what Jennings, Shoebridge and Hellyer are arguing for is a larger military with different platforms and, if you like, a different warfighting frame of mind to that which has dominated. I mean, they're saying quite rightly that we have to be ready to advance our strategic interests, defend our national sovereignty without relying on America to anything like the same extent. So we've got to have a domestic defence industrial base and we've got to have a domestic mindset that is frankly ready for the challenges to come. I mean, I can remember not long after the start of the Ukraine war talking to a large group of young liberals, and I said to them, just think of young people your age in Ukraine. Just think of what's going through their minds right now. Just think of the challenges facing them. We should pray that we never face similar challenges, but the fact is, in an uncertain world, we might. And you, the current military age generation, need to steel yourself to the possibility that more might be asked of you than has been asked of the previous couple of generations of Australians. And I do think these are the fraught times we're living in.
Well, let's just stick on the international front for the time being, and given that we're talking about Trump. So just on another matter related more to the economic side rather than the national security side, the latest news out of the US is that Australia is increasingly unlikely to get an exemption to certain tariffs, in particular on steel and aluminium exports. So it looks like those tariffs will apply to Australia. And I think this just underscores that basically what Trump says is you've got to assume that he's going to do it, whether you like it or not. And yes, you may be able to get out of it, but we've seen him forge ahead with his commitments on tariffs and other matters. What's your assessment of the strategic economic landscape now that Trump's been there for a couple of months and he is forging ahead with his economic agenda?
Well, these are very important issues, Dan, and we do need to ponder them. First point I should make is that when I was in office, I had it as an iron rule that the American president was the leader of the free world. In that sense, he was all of our leader. He was the leader for all of us. And I was never going to be publicly critical of the leader of the free world, whatever I might think. I am going to try to preserve that position, but I will make this little observation. I don't claim to have followed the business career of President Trump, but it does seem that he has this negotiating style, if you like, this public persona where he likes to keep people guessing. He likes to keep people on edge by saying a whole lot of different things, which can be a little bit shocking. And I guess the problem is that so far he's keeping his friends more off balance than I think he's keeping his foes. And just on that score, we need to remember that the mindset of dictators is quite different from the mindset of democratic politicians. I mean, whatever the personality type of the democratic leader might be, in the end, the democratic leader has got to get elected and mostly then get re-elected. So naturally, the mindset of the democratic leader is going to be, how do I put more money in people's pockets? How do I get better roads, better schools, better hospitals, etc.? Dictators are different. They don't face election, or they don't face free and fair elections. So they can think about national glory in a way that is almost unimaginable for a democratic leader. Now, Putin is consumed with the idea of recreating the Russia of Peter the Great. President Xi of China is consumed with the idea of overcoming the century of humiliation and making China once more the world's middle kingdom, in inverted commas. And as for the Ayatollahs in Tehran, they have this apocalyptic vision of a new caliphate. And in the short term, they want to eliminate the little Satan of Israel. And in the long term, they want to eliminate, if they can, the great Satan of the United States. And frankly, I think they are indifferent as to how many might get obliterated in that campaign. So we have to appreciate the mindset behind all of those who are trying to derange the relatively peaceful so-called rules-based global order that's largely pertained since 1945, thanks to the long Anglo-American ascendancy, the Pax Americana. So that's what we've got to understand. Now, there's much good in what President Trump is doing so far. I think on balance, his disruption, with the exception of Ukraine, has been more positive than negative. He has shocked the Europeans, it seems, out of their long-term complacency. I think he has shocked many of us out of our long-term strategic torpor, and that's good. On the other hand, he's done it in a pretty brutal way, and certainly he's very much upset, understandably, all of Ukraine's friends by the brutal session in the Oval Office, by cutting off intelligence support for the Ukrainian armed forces, although it seems that might be in the process of being restored. As I said, on balance, shocking us out of our complacency, forcing the Europeans to take their defence seriously, forcing us to take our defence seriously is probably no bad thing. On the tariffs, look, there's no doubt China has taken advantage of free trade without practising it, because China has stolen technology, utilised market power, rorted markets through subsidies. There's no doubt that high tariffs against China probably do make a lot of strategic sense. I'm not sure that tariffs against your friends make a lot of sense. You can certainly argue that it was a bit of shock and awe to encourage America's neighbours to take better control of their borders, not just people coming across the border illegally, but drug precursors coming across the border illegally. I know that Canada does, it seems, have some tariffs on American exports, which the Americans find aggravating. On the other hand, in his first incarnation, President Trump renegotiated the North American Free Trade Agreement, and after that renegotiation, he claimed it was the best trade deal ever. So why would you suddenly want to upend the best trade deal ever? I hope that, again, a lot of this is sort of negotiating posturing, and that when the dust settles, the relatively seamless North American auto industry will continue. The considerable integration of the US and the Canadian economy will continue, because whatever disagreements there might be between individual politicians on either side of the 49th parallel, the fact is that Canada and America are, if you like, sibling countries in the same way that Australia and New Zealand are sibling countries. And you don't want that kind of long-term friendship, long-term community of values and interests in any way sundered.
Well, let's go to the domestic front now, Tony. And we've had the election in Western Australia, and as predicted, Labor was returned in a thumping majority. At the current count, it looks like Labor have about 41 seats. They'll probably end up at about 45. The Liberals only have 5 seats. They'll probably end up at about 8. And the Nationals have 4. They'll probably end up at 5 seats. So that gives 13 seats for the West Australian Liberal Nationals, and then probably one independent who looks like she's going to win Fremantle. So this is a seismic victory. It was always going to be the case that Labor would win, given how big the victory was under Mark McGowan in the previous election. There were some enormous swings toward the Liberals of 15, 20, 25%, which in some cases still were not enough to get them over the line, which just shows you how far behind they were. But nonetheless, it does appear to have been an underperformance, given, they were hoping to get maybe 12 seats and they're going to fall short of that. So what's your assessment of the WA election, and what does it mean federally, if anything?
Well, obviously, it's part of the mood music of the week in federal politics. I do think that we should not be too quick to draw parallels between federal and state politics. Nevertheless, I think it does show that if you don't create a contest, it's very hard to win. And it wasn't all that clear exactly what the issues in dispute were in the West. I don't think that's going to be the case federally. I think that Peter Dutton has created a very clear contest on energy, on immigration, on national symbols, on things like the housing market. I think there'll be a very clear contest when it comes to national security and border protection. I'm not saying that these cartons shouldn't be further sharpened in the lead up to the election, but I think that we don't want to read too much from the West Australian result into the coming federal contest. But nevertheless, it would have been better for everyone who supports the Liberal Party if the result had been stronger. And let's hope that the coalition in the West, or the Libs and Nats in the West, do identify a few key issues where they are absolutely determined to make a difference, because the government is doing clearly the wrong thing. Now, on things like the native title issues, they fought back effectively and forced the government into a back down. But I'm not sure that there was enough of that, and let's hope there's more of it in the months and years ahead.
When you were Prime Minister, I think there was a couple of state elections during your time, certainly in Victoria, 2014, which went from Liberal to Labor. If I remember correctly, I think Campbell Newman lost during your Prime Ministership in Queensland. How did you sort of go about managing those situations? Did you have a particular approach? Was it to sort of say, this is a state issue? Just interested in how you approach those matters.
Well, it's a very good question. And look, there does tend to be a cycle. And I suppose the two governments that you mentioned were both one-term state governments. And let's be absolutely honest, there were people at the time who said that the federal political situation had fed into both of those losses. I think that, again, it's only at the level of atmospherics that the one feeds into the other. I think the problem with the Baillieu-Napthine government was that it got elected unexpectedly and didn't really have a clear plan for what it was going to do. By the time it had worked out what its plan was, the election was upon it. And the East-West link, for instance, that you might remember, I'd helped to kickstart by promising, I think, $2 billion towards the funding. That had just got underway at the time of the election. And the extraordinary thing was that the incoming Labor government then spent $1 billion not building a road that had already begun. The Campbell government in Queensland, the Campbell-Newman government, well, I think the issue there was that arguably they'd done too much too soon. Campbell was a pretty astringent character. There'd been a lot of public service restructuring, and I think that was the main issue, although you might also remember it happened not long after a certain knighthood was given to a certain Prince Philip, and that probably didn't help. But again, it's the fundamentals, and let's look at the fundamentals of the Albanese government. Living standards have gone backwards by 8% under this government, thanks to inflation, energy costs, mortgage costs. We've had 2 years of negative GDP per person, a household recession. Productivity is back where it was in about 2016. This government's only response to every problem is to spend more, to regulate more, and ultimately to tax more. It does not understand that the only way to create wealth is through the private sector, through individuals and through businesses. This government thinks that government creates wealth, and they'll try to tell us in the next couple of weeks, particularly in the budget, that the government is helping us with cost of living relief. Well, much of the cost of living relief is only made necessary because of government policy, such as the insane emissions obsession that the government's got, which is what's driving up power prices. And in any event, they're basically taking money out of one pocket to shove it in the other pocket, because what we've all got to appreciate all the time, Dan, is government does not spend a dollar that it does not get from us, the taxpayers. So government can only be generous with our money. And unless it's robbing Peter to pay Paul, how are we better off? And if it is robbing Peter to pay Paul, how fair is that?
Yeah.
So look, this is a government which has badly let the people of Australia down. It's failed to address our strategic challenges, our economic challenges, our social challenges. In fact, it's made all of these worse. Our strategic situation is much more parlous now than 3 years ago. It's refused American requests for military assistance for the first time since the ANZUS Treaty. It's let the union bosses back into the workplace through its industrial relations changes. As I said, the energy insanity is a monumental, epic act of self-harm. And then when it comes to social cohesion, what's its answer on things like the anti-Semitism epidemic, the vicious outbreak of Jew hatred? Well, too little too late. And by changing 70 years of bipartisanship at the United Nations on Israel, it's helped to feed some of this stuff. I mean, as Bob Hawke memorably said, if the bell tolls for Israel, it doesn't just toll for Israel, it tolls for all mankind. Well, I just wish Bob Hawke's Labor successors were more conscious of his wise words.
Well, Tony, I think that's a pretty good note to end our chat today. So thanks as always for your time and your insights, and we'll chat again in a couple of weeks.
All right, mate. I look forward to it.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.